But especially here, starting in verse 11, not only does his family line show God's grace, but his family life shows God's grace. He was not the oldest. He was not the strongest. He was not the most likely to succeed in life. He was an overlooked, even by our terms in our time of history, we would call him abused. They didn't like him. They overlooked him. They left him out. But it doesn't matter. If God has his hand on you, God will use you. Verse 11 says this, "And Samuel said to Jesse," this is 1 Samuel 16:11, "Are all the young men here?" And then he said, the dad, Jesse, "Well, there remains yet the youngest, and there he is keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down till he comes here." You say, what's going on? Well, the greatest man in Israel that time, God's prophet, God's oracle, God's anointed man, by the name of Samuel, had come earlier in chapter 16, and the whole town was quaking. He was such an awesome servant of the Lord that it scared people. When he showed up, they didn't know why he was there. And so he shows up, and he says, "I want to see your children," in verse 9. And so Jesse starts shooting the boys in front of him, starting with the oldest, the handsomest, the strongest, the most likely to succeed. And he gets to the end of 7 boys, and he happens to have 8, but he hadn't brought in the 8th one. And that's where we pick up in verse 11. And David's life, first of all, in your notes was on God's mind. God didn't forget him, even if his dad did. God didn't forget him, even if his brothers tried to. And God uses our circumstances. Here is the youngest, the neglected, the unwanted child. Kind of a pattern God has. If you think about it, Cain and Abel, who may have very well been twins, Cain being the older of the twins, who did God pick? The younger of the two. In the next, Ishmael and Isaac, who was older? Ishmael. Who's the firstborn? Ishmael. Who did God pick? Isaac. Jacob and Esau. Who was the first one out? Esau. Who did God pick? The younger, the weaker. You see, he's not into our society, which goes for the macho, tough men that can do it all and women that can run their worlds. He looks for the weak so that he can show his power through them. And that's what was going on in David's life. David was on God's mind. God had chosen him. In spite of his circumstance, God chose the younger in the family, in fact, the youngest, to picture his grace. Who was the youngest in Jacob's family? Joseph. Well, Benjamin, but before Benjamin was born, Joseph. God picked Joseph. All the other 10 he didn't pick. Well, look at verse 12 at the beginning. Secondly, not only is God watching over us, we're on his mind, but David's life was disciplined. And God uses the diligent. He's a very handsome, hardworking boy, but God saw his discipline. It says in 1 Samuel 16, the first part of verse 12, "So he sent and brought him in." And I ask you, from where? His dad says, "Oh, he'll be with the sheep." He didn't think he'd be off sneaking away from the sheep, playing his Nintendo. He didn't think he'd be off, forgetting about the sheep and playing down at the water hole. He knew his son would be where he told him to be. You see, David was disciplined. He would be right where he was supposed to be, watching the flocks. Verse 12 says he was ruddy with bright eyes and good looking. And I think that one of the amazing things is that he didn't have that awful pallor on his face. Have you ever seen, so many of the young people of our day have the youthful vigor just wiped right off of their faces. They're cold, calloused, hardened. Just, there's no glimmer to them anymore. There's none of this. I can just see David coming. His eyes twinkling. He's just saying, "What's next? What can I do? I've done everything I'm supposed to do. What can I do now? I'm ready to go." See, he was disciplined. And God uses those who are diligent.